by the fabulous Jane Evans and the wonderful Carol Russell. Oh, thank you so much. This book, it came out of one long, hot summer.
Yes.
Where we worked remotely from each other, in our gardens, on Zoom, on the phone, on FaceTime, dear God. But what we have today is, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at being bashful and modest. It's brilliant, it is absolutely gorgeous. Designed by the fabulous Jane Evans. So, what we're going to do this afternoon is we're going to do a couple of readings. We'll do a reading first, then we will interview each other. Then we'll do another couple of readings, and then we'll open the floor to you all for any questions. Yes? Yeah. Good, sounds good to me too. Right, off you go, Jane.
All right, so we're going to start on a chapter, hold on, let me get to it, which sort of explains why the book came about. Carol and I met at the National Film and Television School in 2014, and I made the typical white girl mistake of going, "Do you know my other black friend?" And her eyes, that was the expression, that was it, until I said the word Verna Wilkins. And
yeah, I knew Verna Wilkins and I couldn't believe it. It's the first time that had ever happened to me. That someone said, "Do you know my friend?" And inside my head I'm going, I'm just black, I don't know everybody that's black. And blow me down if it wasn't somebody I knew. So Verna Wilkins is a book publisher. She founded the company Tamarind, and she's now sold it, hasn't she, to Random House. And we're going to tell a bit of our stories together. So we're going to start with Jane, and then I will read a bit about from Verna's point of view.
Okay. When Verna Wilkins moved to the white bread Tory stronghold of Camberley, Surrey in the mid-70s, I looked out of the window and thought Makeda herself had moved in next door. I vividly remember the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, alighting from a Renault 4 in a beautifully tailored woolen suit. And my father looking over my shoulder, muttering, "There go the property values." My mum and Verna didn't care for each other's husbands much, probably because they spent the next 20 years or so moaning about them over cups of tea. Mum had never met a black woman before, and her only point of reference was the TV show Love Thy Neighbour. Barbara really did love her neighbour. They were both women out of place. My mum was a socialite, beauty queen and farmer's daughter who'd regularly appeared in the society magazine Tatler. She was locked in the suburbs with a husband who was well down the pecking order at the local golf club. Verna came from a powerful family in Grenada and ended up living in a suburban box under grey skies. They were both queens stuck in a white middle-class prison, raising kids in relationships that weren't ideal in a town filled with judgment. Their experiences may have been different, but they damn well knew how each other felt. Mum was the classic 1960s housewife. Verna was studying at the Open University. They always caught the bus to town together. Mum would come home with a basket full of groceries. Verna's would be filled with books. Mum and I fought tooth and nail for many years. She struggled raising a rebellious daughter who had no intention of marrying a nice young officer from Sandhurst. We had moved to the area specifically for the purpose. From an early age, I didn't feel like I belonged in the family I'd been born into. If I hadn't been born at home, I would have thought there was a mix-up at the hospital. The routine killed me. Monday was wash day and cold roast with baked potatoes for tea. Tuesdays was ironing and chops. Wednesday cleaning and sausage and mash. And Thursday was ladies' day at the golf club. I hated the golf club. Every single thing about it. I hated that my whole family was built around it and that was all these people ever talked to me. But the thing I hated most was the ladies section. To me, it was a pit of toxic femininity ruled by bitches who only gained their power from their husband's worth. I hated that the women were only allowed to play once a week, that they weren't allowed in the men's bar, and none of them made a peep about it. Verna was also the first feminist my mum had ever met. She was younger and became an important bridge between a woman who only wanted her daughter to marry well and the daughter who wanted to change the world. Verna showed Barbara that women could change the world. When I moved to Australia in 1987, Verna started her publishing business. In my phone calls home, Mum knew the last thing I wanted to hear was news from the golf club, so our weekly catch-up was usually filled with Verna's news. When I came home for visits, I would spend hours next door poring over Verna's stunning book illustrations, listening to her stories, laughter and fight. Mum passed away young. She was only 64. Verna was there every step of the way when everyone's hearts were breaking. But there was also strength and laughter and a little bit of revenge. Verna sat in the front row of Mum's funeral cheering me on as I gave the eulogy and told the mean girls from the golf club who my mum really was. They judged her as the marketing manager's wife who couldn't afford designer clothes and couldn't keep her husband. My father had cruelly left her when she was 58 years old, and many of the bitches at the golf club dropped her too. I gave it to them with both barrels. None of them had been in the Tatler. But it wasn't until a few years later that I learned something I'd always felt but couldn't explain. It was 2002. I was going through a very messy separation from the father of my children. I ran my agency and I couldn't cry in front of my staffs and clients. I couldn't cry in front of my ex or his mother who was living upstairs with us in the business. I couldn't cry in front of my daughters who were both under 4. I needed space. I needed to come home. And I'm just going to stop at this point because my dear friend Karen Lane actually sat with me for a week where I cried and cried and cried. Since sitting at Verna's kitchen table on the last day, she told me a story I had never heard before. One day, my mum sat at Verna's table and said, "I finally worked it out. Jane's not my daughter. She's yours." I'd been wrong for all of those years. I wasn't born into the wrong family. I was blessed to have 2 mums.
Verna. Going into publishing was not on my to-do list. Originally, I was a college lecturer at a technical college in Surrey. I taught English, focusing on business English for 16 plus in further education. What prompted my decision were 2 things. One was bringing up 2 boys close in age and then realising that none of the books I could buy in shops or get from the local library in Britain showed images of black children or reflected their lives at all. The second was being a lecturer in Surrey in a college. The pupils I taught were 99% white, and every year I'd have to go through exactly the same thing. The pupils would come into the classroom and I would be there in the front of the class, but they would always ask, "So where's the lecturer then?" And I'd have to explain it was me every year. And I realised that these kids had learnt at the time that an English lecturer didn't look like me. That's what they'd learnt. What they were looking for was a white male or, at a push, white female member of staff. None of my white colleagues had to have that fight to identify themselves as a lecturer before they even opened a book. It was shocking. On top of that, I had my own children, young children, in the same system that had produced these children who sat before me every year. And I realised that my children were reading the same books at school that these children had read in their schools. It made me think, what was the impact of invisibility on my children of colour? When they reached 16, would I be invisible to them too? So I set out to find books with black children in them, but I couldn't find any here. I did get a few from my sisters in America, and when the boys were little, my husband and I did a lot of things with them because I'd seen the dangers of omission and what it does to children, black and white. But I kept coming back to the importance of children seeing themselves in picture books and, as they got older, in their reading materials. So this invisibility was also at the back of my mind. What was crucial to me in creating those first books was to give children of colour a sense of self and personal value, Because if they don't see themselves in all jobs and roles in the world, they tend to grow up thinking some jobs are not for them. And non-black children will grow up thinking there are jobs black people can't do, roles they shouldn't expect to see us in. Because racism isn't something someone is born with, it's a learnt behaviour. We've left loads for you to read. So now I'm going to interview my friend. So Jane, what was it about our conversations that made you want to put them into a book?
Look, I think this has probably come out later since we started, but really it was like, the last thing the world needs is another book by a white middle-class feminist. Oh, sorry. The last thing the world needs is another book by a white middle-class feminist. And, you know, if we are going to come together to solve this problem for midlife women, we have to come together as a sisterhood. But also, you know, Carol and I have a rule. We don't answer the phone to each other unless we've got 2 hours to spare. Seriously, we do not. And, you know, and we've had the difficult conversations. You know, there's been times where she's, you know, put me on hold. I'm not talking to you for 2 weeks over that one. You're out. And you know, and you know, and I think Ali over here said it the other day. She said, "I'm a recovering racist."
Yeah.
And you know, I think all of us white people are recovering racists to some extent. So you know, I think when we came to do the book, first of all, I'd already written the book to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Was about to redo it, and I was, and George Floyd had happened,
Yeah.
and it was like, I can't do this by myself. And every single thing that I had ever written, that first draft, had been discussed at great length with Carol. So there was nothing I'd written that she wasn't a part of anyway. So when we ripped apart the book and we're starting again, it was like, I'm starting again with Carol, and I'm going to start with these difficult conversations that we've had, and the fun conversations,
Yes.
and you know, and the silly conversations.
Yes.
But you know, if we are going to come together as a sisterhood to solve ageism for midlife women,
Yeah.
then we have to do it as a sisterhood.
We absolutely do. Yes. Thank you. You can ask me a question now. I'll let you.
So how did you meet Verna Wilkins?
I met Verna because I'd been invited by a woman called Sandra Agard. Sandra Agard is a librarian. She was a librarian at Peckham Library. And she's a wonderful, wonderful woman, and she's brilliant at getting people together. So at the particular time when I met Verna, Sandra had decided to bring together all the black writers that she knew and whose works were sitting in her library. So there was Verna, there was Mallory Blackman, there was Valerie Bloom, there was, oh God, Dorothy Coomson, there were so many of us. And so she invited us to have lunch at Cotton's on her. And I'm not one to let go of a free lunch. So I went and I walked into this restaurant and I was late. Oh God. I was looking for somewhere to park, and I finally found somewhere to park, and I rushed into this restaurant and I could see them all sitting at the table, and they all looked so important and they all looked so confident, and I felt, oh, maybe I'm in the wrong place, and maybe Sandra will find out, you know, she shouldn't have invited me. And Verna saw me and she just said, come and sit down here by me. And I sat beside her, and for the rest of that day, it was the most wonderful thing. She'd just hold my hand and make sure that I was all right and make sure that I was included. And yeah, that's how I met Verna. And Verna has been and held a very special place in my life since then. Oh, thank you. Now, Jane, a question that was asked of me about you was about how frank you are about your mental health issues in this business that you found yourself working in. Would you talk to us a little bit about how tough it was in the business when you joined?
Oh my goodness. So I was the first girl in a creative department, I think 5 times in my career, between 1982 and 1992. And as you know, creative departments of advertising agency are incredibly competitive environments. I started my career with a disabled black man. And we were, you know, we joked that we actually had filled the quota. And we walked in there, and you know, we would sit in our office and absolutely feel for each other, because we would see the everyday sexism and we would see the everyday racism, and we could feel what was happening with each other. Unfortunately, at the time, being a man, it was almost impossible for him to advance in his career with a female copywriter. And so a year into my career, he dropped me. And I was out of, like, I was in the big agency, it was the coolest, hottest agency in town. I couldn't get another job, and I went to this tiny little agency, and everybody's like, you know, you're making a big mistake here, Jane, you're making a big mistake. But at that tiny little agency, I worked with this new little client that nobody had ever heard of, and launched Microsoft Word version 1. And so what had appeared to be like the worst possible move I had ever made in my career, now is one of the greatest moves in my career, because not only can I say that I worked on Microsoft Word version 1, but I turned down a date with Bill Gates too. Probably the worst time in my career was in 1992, when I was the first woman in a creative department. In 1982, I was a novelty, and it was quite different, and it was quite unusual. But by 1992, it was war. And I remember going and seeing my going to try and see my creative director, and the secretary was like, "Oh no, he's doing a radio interview for the positive portrayal of women," of which my response was, Anyway, I caught him after the interview, and he was 6'5", and he's just poking me, going, "Fucking hairy-legged, fucking feminists. If women want to play ball, we're going to play even fucking harder." And he's poking me in the chest as he's doing this. And I went from being an ambitious woman to being the head of a terrorist organisation. I was seen as being the feminist that was out there to fight the men. And you know, a few months after that, I was handcuffed to a gurney by 2 police officers, and joking, going, "But I'm wearing Zampatti. One simply can't be committed in Zampatti, darling." And that was through my training. When I started at art school, there was a thing called the Grant Enlarger. And for an art director, it was a great big camera that you basically stood on the box, leaned in, and put a curtain behind your head. So your ass was just sticking out all the time. And I was 18 years old at art school, and my teacher pinched my bum. And I turned around, I was like deathly embarrassed. And he was like, "Jane, you're just about to get into the creative department of an advertising agency. You've got to have an answer like that, like that, like that, like that, like that." And I know this sounds awful to modern women, but that was actually the best training I ever got at art school, because I just had an answer for them. So a few years later, when I was working late at the Grant Enlarger, and the CEO of the company came up and dry humped me, I pulled back the curtain and said, "Could you do that to Mike? You pay him more than me." The next day, I got my salary doubled. So, you know, it was tough, but I had been trained to fight back, and to fight back with humour, and not to be afraid of it. So, so that's.
Yeah, and you're such a resilient woman, such a resilient woman. I love it.
The other thing is, you know, in my life, I've probably had 8 weeks where I've had a mental illness as such. Now, you've all had flu for that length of time in your lives. Nobody defines you by that. And so I refuse to be defined by 8 weeks of my life.
Yeah. What do you want to know?
What do I want to know? What do I want to know? How can white women be better sisters to black women?
Now. How long have you got, people? Yeah? Okay. I'll see if I can squeeze it in. I think one of the main ways that white women can be better allies to their black sisters and their other ethnically diverse sisters is to learn a bit about who we are, where we come from, and what our history is. Because that will help you understand why we are here, what we are doing here, and what we have been through to get here. And I believe that once you know that, you'll start looking at us in a different way, and you will be willing to stand up beside us and fight for what we as all women want, which is respect. Okay. What's the job that you did, the thing that you launched that you're most proud of?
Oh my goodness. It's really hard to say, because I've had actually a really successful career, which is why it was really surprising when in my 50s I became invisible. So probably one of the things I'm most proud of is James Squire beer. In 1997, I created one of the world's first craft beers. And it is now the biggest craft beer in Australia. And so again, with all the white advertising guys that go, I won this at Cannes, I won this and that, I was going, people will be drinking my beer at my funeral. So that's one. I think what we're creating with Ali at Brixton Finishing School is something that I'm incredibly proud of. And I'm also incredibly proud of creating the uninvisibility movement.
Yes, oh.
So with my dear, the wonderful Jackie Duckworth over there. So my story was I came back to the UK. I went to the National Film and Television School and studied screenwriting, which is where I met Carol. And then in 2015, a statistic came out that only 3% of the world's creative directors were female. Now, the reason why that's important is creative directors are people who decide what you see in ads. So I very loudly stuck my hand up, and Antoinette Delissa over there will know how loudly I stuck my hand up, and was completely and utterly ignored by my industry, even though I was the most ridiculously overqualified candidate. And I would go to interviews and I would be met with things like, Jane, I'd give you a job, but you'd end up as the old woman at the back of the department doing the shit that nobody else wants. I then thought I'll set up an agency and go and see clients, and clients would go, Jane, I just want to be frank with you, our target market is 19, and if anything, we're going even younger. And my response to that was, well, who the hell do you think's buying all this stuff for the people 19? So I actually got to the point where I was being evicted, I'd run out of money, I'd taken out a loan, I couldn't pay it back. Things were absolutely awful. I woke up one morning with just like this idea, I wonder if there are actually any women over the age of 50 creating ads in London. So I woke up in the morning, 9:30 in the morning, just put out the tweet. And it got retweeted 64 times with answers like hen's teeth and unicorn tears easier to find. And I was given 8 names, one of which was the beautiful Janessa up there. And I went and met these women and I photographed them and I told their stories. And I thought I was setting up a sort of Humans of New York type thing where I'd be sort of saying, here are some amazing midlife women. We got 2 million hits on our hashtag in the first 2 weeks. And it was really quite apparent that this wasn't just an advertising problem. This was a societal narrative that needed to change, that was happening across the board for all women. And so over the last 2 years, we've built it and we've grown it. We've found the greatest female creators of our era from all around the world. And we're saying to clients, we buy 50.3% of everything. Please don't get kids talking to us. There are perfectly brilliant, award-winning creative women that can talk to this audience. Yeah. And so now we've grown it into 3 parts, that there's the movement, there's an advertising agency, and I will talk about this later when I do my reading of the book, and a training scheme to get midlife women into digital marketing, where there is a skill shortage, and they're training young people. And so why not train midlife women? Because we say, they say that millennials is going to be lifelong learning and multiple careers. And we're saying, well, we were the pioneers of female careers. Let's pioneer this new way of working. Start with us. So, that's what I want you to tell me about what's exciting happening in your life at the moment.
So many things, so little time. Well, the thing that's really, really exciting to me at the moment is along the lines that you just talked about. It's about getting women back out working and doing things that they want to do. And as a creative, of course, that's where I'm looking. So I set up a company called Fresh Voices UK in 2011 to champion the work and amplify the work of British, ethnically diverse writers. And I started at BAFTA. I used my membership and nagged those people until they gave me a room. And I put on rehearsed reading, that's the word I was looking for. A rehearsed reading for an audience of television producers and an ordinary television watching audience. I call it doing my Simon Cowell on them, so that they would see that there was an audience for the things that we were writing. So I did that. And now we're in the position where the production community has taken the baton from me, and they're now doing the work that I was doing. So they are doing table reads, they are doing courses, boot camps where people are paid to write a script that then gets them in with a production company. And so now we're in a position where we're seeing people coming through. So once I saw that, and I sat around for about a year and a half going, now what am I going to do? Because that's being taken care of, and I'm really grateful that that's been taken care of. And then I realised that women over 45, where were we in theatre? Where were we? Where were we? And I thought, okay, I can see us as actors. We're there as actors. I can see us as directors. Yes, we're there as directors. I can see us as producers. We're there as producers. Well, what we weren't was there as writers. So I moaned on for a bit, because that's what I do. I have a bit of a moan. And then I think, right, okay, what can we do about it? And my friend Judith Bryan over there and I decided that what we were going to do was a project that we call Raised Voices. And this project is to bring to the fore black women over 45 years old who are writing. Now, we're not talking about writers who've been writing for a long time necessarily. It's writers who have had another career. So one of our writers, for example, was a journalist, and now she's gone into playwriting, and she won a prize last year. She won the Alfred Fagan Award last year. And another one of our writers is a university lecturer. Another one of our writers was a barrister who decided that she wanted to write. And so what our aim is to put on works by those women. We were really lucky before COVID came and hit us. We'd managed to get the Young Vic to agree to put on some of the work, and we managed to get the Bush Theatre in Hammersmith to agree to do the other part of the project, which is an intergenerational part of the project, where we have those women who are over 45 talking to their little sisters who are under 45, talking about the craft that they do, the work that they've produced. And I wanted to bring both generations together, because too often we're kept completely apart, and the younger women don't know about us, and we can be looking down and not really knowing about them because they're not necessarily writing stuff that we're going to see. And I want to pull us all together so that we go and see each other's work. We support each other in the way that I believe we should. That's what's exciting for me right now.
Shall we read a bit more of the book?
Yeah, let's go. You start.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I'm actually going to read us the last chapter. And the reason why I want to read us the last chapter is throughout this book, we have really followed, we've been following our own words. We have really, as we've been writing things, we've been following them. But also throughout the book, there are stories of incredible women. And rather than doing how-tos or, sort of how-to sections, is we've told women's stories that actually relate to what's going on for us. And so the last chapter for me is one of the most, my favourite of the women's stories. So I'll read you the whole chapter, and I think you'll see why the last chapter is so important to us. But should we start this chapter off with each chapter
Yes.
starts with one of our telephone conversations. So this is actually the latest one, as we're putting the last version to the to the typesetters. So Uninvisibility just landed our first paying ad client, and it's a biggie.
I have news too. I just sold my first international pilot.
Oh my God, we're overnight successes.
Only took 10 years.
Most of us are lucky to have midlife women in our lives. Ask anyone about their mum, their aunt, their granny, mentor or their friend, and their face will light up. No, we're not all perfect, and we'll never agree on everything. But when we embrace our differences to fight the forces of invisibility, the world will discover a resource it's never seen before. One that is loved, revered, and ready to clean up this whole sorry mess. This is time for action, not words, and we are women of our word. The Uninvisibility Project started out as a social media platform to change the narrative for midlife women, and we've put everything that we've written in this book into practice. In September 2020, Mark Reed, the CEO of WPP, one of the world's largest advertising groups, was quoted somewhat out of context as saying, "We have a very broad range of skills, and if you look at our people, the average age of someone who works at WPP is less than 30. They don't hark back to the 1980s, luckily." The industry, or parts of, and the trade press at least, was up in arms. Jane put out a very public call to say the Uninvisibility Project wanted words. To his credit, Mark picked up the phone. He was expecting a fight. He got a whole heap of tend and befriend. That call was followed by a long letter, which another woman in the book, Dame Stephanie Shirley, told everybody to win new business, write long letters, that put forward an idea that would solve two of his immediate problems. We could rapidly increase the percentage of midlife workers in his organisation while filling a skills gap the whole industry is grappling with. It would help him outperform his competitors, including some of the more vocal ones. One of Mark's biggest critics during this saga was his predecessor turned competitor. There was definitely a lot of pot calling kettle going on, as illustrated by this July 2020 Ad News interview where ex-CEO of WPP, Sir Martin Sorrell, described his new holding company's workforce. The average age is about 33. On the media side, about 600 at business unit Mighty Hive. The average age is about 25. The reason why they're so young is that programmatic people are difficult to find, and we tend to train them ourselves. We hire them from good schools, and then we train them and put them into data analytics or programmatic. We simply reminded Mark that the best school is the school of life. Why not train those graduates too? We teamed up with the Brixton Finishing School, who run courses to find diverse young people from underprivileged backgrounds for these roles. And within weeks, Visible Start was born and funded by WPP. Now midlife women have the opportunity to train in digital media online in their own time and enter a pipeline where there are real jobs and further training waiting with open arms. Can you do something similar in your industry, in your community? Let's all work together to get us all working. But also, let's look after the people who fall through the cracks when the world is shaking. We'd like to end this book with a story of hope. Like most of the pioneering women we have featured, they have a story and experience that has huge significance for the world we live in today. When we adopted to lockdown, we knew there were many people doing it harder than us. Now we face such uncertainty. Take heart in the story of two women who've been there, done that, and survived. Maha and Muna Salfiti. On the 28th of September 2000, Muna Salfiti held hands with her 3 small children and prayed. She asked God to give her the courage to protect them. For the next 5 years, it was almost impossible to leave her house. There wasn't an invisible enemy lurking outside her door. There were snipers, bombs, rocks, and deadly crossfire. It's almost impossible to explain the 2000 to 2005 Palestinian Intifada. The Arabic word translates as tremor, shivering, shuddering. The truth of what it was, how it happened, and why it lasted so long is lost in a muddled mess from 80 years of propaganda built on thousands of years of myths. As a young mother, how do you explain to your children to keep away from the windows and not go outside, not even the back door? And as Christians, how do you guide your children to follow in the footsteps of Jesus without setting foot on the very streets they were born to walk? I remember the first time the Israeli soldiers invaded Ramallah. People were so scared and screaming in the streets, and this was something that was really new for me to deal with, and it's something I can't explain because it involves lots of blood, lots of anger, lots of different things that I had to make my children understand at a young age. So that was really hard. But then it's something that we believe in, something that we have lived, and something that we needed to fight for. Not everyone can hold a weapon. My weapon was my education for my children. Muna's instinct was to learn everything she could about the situation, which she reported to her older sister Maha with such regularity that Maha described Muna as her own personal CNN. 6 months in, they really started to worry. It's estimated that between the 28th of September 2000 and 7th of March 2001, 41 Palestinian schools were closed or unable to operate, and approximately 20,000 Palestinian students were missing out on their education. So the two sisters joined with their friend, a maths teacher, the only subject they couldn't handle between them, and set up a homeschool for their close family's children. On the first day, 8 children crawled on their hands and knees to get there. The second day, 18 showed up. On the third, they had 50 children risking their lives in hope of creating a better one. In the midst of all this chaos and danger, Maha and Muna created some normality. My whole house was divided into rooms and classes. We divided the children into age groups, and we had classes for the whole time. We even taught languages like French, as well as the main subjects, social studies, science, maths, Arabic, English, everything, you name it, it was there. And the children just loved it and wanted to join this school more than their regular schools. Even though we had discipline, we had order. We had schedules we had to follow with recess, lunch and breaks, and it worked really well. It still has an impact on the children because they felt that they really had to stand against whatever was forced upon us, and they prevailed. They got their education, they got everything. They even had a bullet flying through the middle of class. In the hardest of times, Maha and Muna drew on the strength of her fellow Palestinians who believed that they will one day rise like phoenixes from the ashes. They taught their children to deal with life issues, to be strong and to stand up for themselves. Both women remember the Intifada as being very hard for them, and they did what they had to do. But looking back, it was fun and inspirational, something that was really good for the children and has become a joy to remember. We wish the same for all of you. This too shall pass, and we really can make things better.
I'm going to read about one of my heroines. One of my heroines that's actually sitting in this room. Her name is Diane Abbott. Black politician Diane Abbott began her parliamentary career under a Thatcher-led Conservative government, and even though the job of Member of Parliament is unlike any other, her path and career has lessons for us all, as her hard-won fight represents some of the intense battles a lot of women have faced on their way up the ladder to the peak of their careers. As well as the battles we face now in the 21st century as midlife women, with all our experience and expertise as we fight to be seen and heard. Diane Abbott is a pioneer and a heroine for many women of African descent, and clearly many white women in her constituency of Hackney North and Stoke Newington. She made history when she was elected as an MP on the 11th of June 1987, the first woman of African Caribbean descent to ever hold that role. It is the very first thing that's said of her in any profile, and while it isn't important to her, she understands that it is for many people of African descent. She told interviewer Kirsty Young in her 2008 appearance on the Desert Island Discs, "I remember when I was first elected meeting an older West Indian woman. She said, 'You know, every time I see you on the television, I feel big.'" And you know, there are lots of people at the time for whom to see somebody like themselves in Parliament was very empowering. In 1983, Out of 650 MPs, there were only 23 women serving in Parliament. In the year Diane took her seat, only 41 women were elected to Parliament. There were no MPs of African or Asian descent, male or female, so a lot of people didn't believe a black working class woman could be voted into Parliament. In fact, a lot of people in Hackney didn't believe she could get elected. And in the darkest hours of the night, after campaigning hard all day, even Diane sometimes wondered if she could. So when she prevailed with 48.7% of the vote, she was, in her own words, in a daze for months afterwards. In recent years, Diane has been much maligned, but a quick examination of her career reveals a dedication to serving the British public and a multitude of achievements. The child of a welder and a nurse, Diane, bright and hardworking, passed the 11 plus and won a place at Harrow County Grammar School for girls. On the first day, she found she was the only girl of African descent there. She was probably the first black girl to attend the school. And she tells a story that is familiar to many children of African descent. Shortly after arriving there, her teacher set an essay assignment in her class. And the following week, the teacher gave out the marks for the assignment. She started at the top with the students who'd received the highest marks, ending with the ones who'd got the lowest. Diane listened as she went down the list from A+, then A minus, and she still hadn't heard her name and was really surprised because in primary school she never got a lower mark than an A. She listened as the teacher read out all the grades and all the names of all the other girls in her class, and her name was not called. When the teacher was done, Diane went to her afterwards. The teacher's desk was on a dais maybe 6 inches high, and as Diane stood there, the teacher picked up her essay between her finger and thumb, looked down at her and said, "Where did you copy this essay?" Because she could not believe that this chubby, bespectacled black girl standing in front of her could have written that essay. For the rest of that year, Diane didn't write to her full potential because she never wanted to be humiliated like that again. And it wasn't until she was in the second year with a teacher who believed in her that she began to blossom again. This was not the only time this kind of thing happened to her during her time at Harrow County, but she began the process of growing the thick skin she was going to need as an African Caribbean woman in Britain. There's more for you to read.